Good. Okay. Hello and welcome, everyone. It's a rowdy crowd this morning for a Saturday in Easton, Maryland. Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me well? Great. My name is Ben Simons. I'm the director of the Academy Art Museum, and we're thrilled to welcome Gretchen Diebenkorn Grant here, the daughter of Richard Diebenkorn, our featured artist in our show Beginnings. So welcome, Gretchen. Not yet. And her husband, Dick Grant, we've gotten to know as well, and just a delightful people. We're happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Gretchen does not like lengthy introductions, but I would like to thank a few people in the room and who helped us receive this wonderful show, Beginnings. The show comes from the Diebenkorn Foundation, and it was organized in conjunction with the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento. We had Scott Shields here, the curator of the show and author of the catalog, for a wonderful talk in the Kittredge-Wilson series. And this continues the series with a focus on Diebenkorn. So we're just delighted. It's a full house, which is also thrilling to see. I think we may switch lectures to weekends. Does that sound like a good idea? Okay. When you see the full house, that kind of gives you a sign that it's working. But I would like to thank Dorsey Waxter, who's here with us tonight, and John Van Doren of Van Doren Waxter in New York. They represent the Diebenkorn Foundation, and it was through Dorsey, whose parents, Archie and Nancy Waxter, were so involved in the community here, that we got to learn of the show and then ultimately secured the show as the only East Coast venue of its appearance. I'd also like to thank Andrea Liguori of the Diebenkorn Foundation, who came to the opening, and Brent Foster Jones as well. It's just been really fun getting to know all of you, and we feel like we've gotten a real insider understanding of the artist. I think one of the great strengths of the show is that it shows you, as some people have said, the artist's mind almost in evolution as he tries different influences and pathways and then arrives at his own voice and his own self. And we'll hear more about that. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, individual sponsors who have supported the show, as well as the Maryland State Arts Council, which provides us with general support, and the Talbot County Arts Council as well, which is very important for all that we do, exhibitions and education as well. Also like to welcome Ken and Ellen Chance, who have a wonderful piece on loan to the show. It's the only loan piece in the show. They're here from North Carolina, so welcome to you as well. But now join me in welcoming Gretchen Diebenkorn Grant. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks. Thank you, Ben. And he has taken care of almost all of my thank yous. I would like to mention Anke van Wagenberg, who is the person who hung the show here, their chief curator of the Academy Art Museum, which is wonderful. And just an extra thanks to my husband, Dick Grant, who will be running the slides for me, and who, when I say, well, I think I'd like to switch this slide with another slide yesterday, he does things like that, and I'm very grateful. It makes life rather nice for me. So, good morning. I am often asked what it's like to live with a creative man, and in this case, a particular creative man, Richard Diebenkorn, who was not only an artist, but also my greatly loved father. On the understanding that I'm speaking to you today as a daughter, an admiring daughter, and not as an art historian, I will share some of my thoughts about my father with you. I want to spend a moment giving you a brief and very simplified synopsis of his career to help put these very early works in perspective. These early pictures concern his development as an artist, his looking at the world through the eyes of a man who had ideas to explore and was trying many different ways to express them. First of all, we'll see, this is during the war. He sketched, he was on the East Coast here for a while, and this is a picture of a guy who had returned from Guadalcanal. These, you can see he's developing a little bit more of an abstract style toward the end of the war. And after the war, he settled primarily on abstraction, and for a decade, he examined the world primarily from that point of view. So first of all, I'll give you a little overview of where we lived, because I think it's very important in my father's life where he lived because of the light and the things that he saw when he was in these various places. This is Sausalito, where the family was in the late 40s. This first picture is from 1947. And the second picture is the one referred to by Ben Simons that was lent to this show specifically by Dr. and Mrs. Kenneth Jace. And this picture won in the San Francisco Art Association's Emanuel Walter Purchase Prize in 1948, when my father was in his early 20s. The next picture is, as you can see, he's moving into a slightly different direction from these early, more angular things, and this is from 1948. And in 1950, we moved to Albuquerque for my father to pursue his master's on the GI Bill. This picture is Disintegrating Pig from 1950, and this was in his master's show. And in 1952, we moved to Urbana, and this picture is the Archer, which was a particular family favorite. My mother had it in her house to the end of her life. After a year in Urbana didn't suit my parents particularly. They missed the water, they missed the light. It was very flat. And they wanted to move back to California. So they moved to Berkeley. And you can see he's still doing abstraction at the beginning of the time that he moved to Berkeley. This picture you could have seen a couple of years ago, not far away, if you were invited to dinner at the private dining room of the Obamas. He picked that for his dining room from the National Gallery. The next picture, Seawall, and you can see, although this is certainly an abstract picture, it's definitely also a landscape, and this, we believe, was influenced by the westernmost coast of San Francisco. Next, we see him moving very far away from abstraction, and although there's still, of course, elements there. But this is Coffee that's at the San Francisco Museum, painted in 1959. Then in 1966, my parents decided to move to Los Angeles, and my father's studio was in Ocean Park. Now, the first paintings that he was doing at that time were still relatively not abstract, but you can see he's moving closer and closer again to abstraction. And then the next picture is Ocean Park number 27, which was done in 1970. And the next one, Ocean Park 122, which was done in 1980. This is one of my particular favorites, a very calming picture. In 1988, they moved to Healdsburg, California, which is about an hour and a half north of San Francisco. For those of you who are familiar, this is in the Sonoma Valley. And this picture coming up, this one was done in 1991. He remade a barn in Healdsburg to be his studio, and popped up the roof to get the north light, and was working there. This is from 1991. Now you see that he's moving away from the more linear abstraction, and actually I've always thought that it related quite closely to some of the works in this show that he did as a very young man. So he's still exploring ideas that were there for a long time. Next picture, you can see he's even farther in that direction. This was done in 91. And finally, the last picture, he was very ill at the time that he was living in Healdsburg, shortly after they moved there. And this is the skull that he made that traditionally artists paint skulls when they're contemplating death, and my mother would not allow this in the house. It was always in the studio. And when he died, I chose it because he and I had talks about it, and I really liked it. This beautiful show that you have outside here gives us a window into an artist both finding his voice and finding the means to express it. Rarely are we given an opportunity to view something like this. We observe him experimenting with the ideas of other artists and then making them his own. We see him exploring the depths of his own particular mind. And we see him responding to his life in his observations of his surroundings, and particularly in his responses to the war. I should say wars. This picture is of my father when he was stationed in Hawaii. He was to be dropped behind enemy lines to draw maps. And very fortunately for him, since very few people lived during that particular job, the war ended before he was sent. He was committed to a life of observing so deeply that distractions and interruptions were not as important as what he was putting through the resources of his own mind. I sense he found his life, and specifically his surroundings, to be his muse. Some artists have lives in society or use their art to express their political views. My father was conflicted at best by social events, and although he was very committed and informed about the politics of his time, and indeed created posters and sets of etchings to be sold to support these opinions, his art didn't overtly reflect his politics. This is not to say that he lived outside his historical context or was unaffected by world events. Quite the opposite was true. He engaged with other artists of his time and studied the artists of the past. This is a work titled Homage to Brock. He had seen a beautiful Brock exhibition and was inspired by one of the pictures to do this picture in 1988. A book that I remember my father showing me was an examination of artist work that referred back to the work of other artists, themes and variations. Now, to me, my father is a part of a long history of artists who observed and interpreted the world in an informed and committed way. All of his work is connected, all a part of a continuum of the way this particular person observed and reacted to the world around him. As a child, he was given his father's shirt cardboards to use for his drawings. Now, this was done when he was 16. But you can already see the use of the diagonal, the strong use of diagonals, and certain things that I see in his work toward the very end. Because he was an only child, initially, I think it was a way for people to keep him busy. His grandmother painted quite lovely landscape paintings, and she was interested in taking him to art exhibitions. One of the ones that he was taken to by his grandmother was a Van Gogh show in San Francisco, and there was no one there, and people were just scathing in their remarks about the show, which I think is quite interesting, considering the last time I went to a Van Gogh show, I had to peep through 100 people to see a square inch of the painting. Some of my favorite memories of my father have to do with the way he taught me to see. I am unable to look at certain places or certain things without thinking of him. There is a place as you approach the Bay Bridge on the way to San Francisco from the East Bay where you can see the water, and he would comment on the color of the water that day as opposed to another, from khaki all the way to bright, shiny blue. He taught me to see the variation of color within something that we would describe as yellow or blue. that reflection, shadow, worn places, dirt, etc., can affect the color we see if we look more completely and carefully. Though we think of a rattan chair as mottled tan, we still recognize it when its colors are pushed or altered into a different part of the spectrum. He was very taken with useful objects, such as a really well-made pair of pliers, scissors, kitchen implements, or old, well-worn tools. He appreciated form as it related to function in a very particular way. Our life was organized around his life, and always was. When he was drawing or in the studio, he was not to be disturbed, and often the studio was in the house, so you can imagine children running through. Not a good thing. As a grandfather, he shared much of his fantastic sense of humor and delight in images with my children. He carved pumpkins, made Easter eggs, drew with them, and generally shared his work with them as well as with the rest of us. Now, this is Robo Bird, which he made with my son. And just very fanciful, wonderful creature. This was in the early 70s, so not from any particular movie or anything like that. The next picture, this is a dragon picture that he drew, again, with my son. And my father did a few scales. If you can see, these are all little tiny movements here. Marks with the pencil. And my father did a few, I believe, around the face or something in here. And then he turned to my husband and he said, well, now you do the rest. You do the rest of the scales. And so when my husband completed the scales, then you can see that there are two signatures on this work. There's RD on one side and RG on the other. This is Running Dog, a present for our son. This is made with tar paper, construction tape, and it's about 6 feet wide. My son has it in his dining room, and it fills the entire wall. And then my father heard that my husband and I were making our daughter a dollhouse, and he said, well, you can't have a house without paintings. And so he made all the paintings on the upper row, and they're the size of matchbooks. They are mostly collages, and down that we've photographed, or I should say Dick photographed, the back of them, and you can see that this one, he credits Egon Schiele because he started with a Schiele postcard and he cut it down and he added some stuff, and so he decided he better give Schiele some credit. They are all framed with little tiny pieces of wood, and they are literally the size of matchbooks, and they're so beautiful. They're just, so her dollhouse was filled with these wonderful, wonderful paintings. He presented it to her in a cigar box that he had decorated, which we still have. So it had silver stripes on it and all kinds of things. He didn't like to shop, so when birthday or Christmas came along, he and my mother would determine what they were going to give, and he would make a card and accompany it with a check. So this first one was when I was pregnant with our daughter, and I really wanted to have a rocking chair. And this was my gift of the rocking chair, the very elaborate bentwood rocker. And the one I got was not quite so elaborate, but definitely bentwood. My son was growing very fast and needed a new bed, so this is his card for the new bed. My husband and I went to New York one time and left the children with my parents. And they gave us this card for Christmas. And it's in New York, and it was for Bonnier's, which we thought was a bar. So we were looking everywhere for a bar named Bonnier's, but it turns out it was a store to buy wine glasses. We never found it, needless to say. Le Veau d'Or, which was a restaurant that my parents particularly loved and wanted to share with us, and other delights. Oh, the Whitney Museum, how could I forget? 4 Eyes, and from my parents, yeah. And then finally, this last card, my mother was starting a new job and she needed a suit. And so when her birthday came along, or perhaps it was Christmas, we're not really sure on the chronology here, he made this. Now this is 3-dimensional. This is the front and this is the back. And it hangs with its own little hook. And then he took her and they got some suits. When I was little, just what his profession actually was confused me. He referred to himself as a painter. But in my really early years, he also painted houses occasionally. Additionally, he taught painting. And the fathers of my friends had quite conventional jobs. They didn't have paint under their fingernails all the time, worked normal hours, and did recreational things on the weekend. Explaining this father of mine, who was definitely not easily categorized, was tough, especially when friends came to our house and took a look around. Now, these next 2 photographs were done by Morley Bear, who was commissioned by the Oakland Museum to document my parents' house shortly before they moved to Los Angeles. The way our various houses looked inside was different from any of the houses of my friends. The furniture wasn't conventional. Much of it was designed and made by my father or found by him in junk stores. My parents resisted curtains and drapes, possibly because of what one misses when the exterior view is obscured, and certainly also because of the resulting loss of light. The couch in our living room, and I don't mean sofa, was covered in an Indian bedspread and usually had our dog, Valentine, sleeping on it. And you can see Valentine there along with a little orange paper ball that I made in school. In an era where everything, it seemed to me, was supposed to be matched, sweater sets, purses and shoes, furniture, cups and saucers, nothing matched anything else in our house. My father changed what was hanging on the walls often. Now, new works were constantly moving in and out of the house. He would hang one and look at it for a few days or weeks, and then another picture took its place. There were drawings and objects on every available ledge, and piles of framed drawings and paintings leaned against the walls. And then we get to what was on the walls. In my early years, they were hung with abstract works, and of course my friends would ask why we had things like that on the walls. They would inevitably point out that they could make something like that that was just as good or even better. My brother and I were admonished not to find objective things in the pictures, the abstract pictures, and this began to get complicated in the Berkeley period as my father began exploring figuration. So I didn't know how to react to this painting, which appeared hanging opposite me one morning at breakfast. How would I talk about it? It clearly was a horse, and the horse clearly had a rider. And I was just left to contemplate this painting opposite me. Also during this time, there were lots of drawings of nude women, and occasionally men as well. And of course, these drawings mostly resulted in averted eyes, or in some cases, covert glances, but only in very rare instances any appreciation or understanding by my friends. My mother told me I went through an extended period during which I longed to live in an ordinary house, furnished with matching things, that was a simple variation on the house next door and the one next door to that. But in our house, everything had a visual significance. When we lived in Albuquerque, my parents made their own beer. And so we went out in the car, collected beer bottles from the side of the road, took them home, sterilized them, And then my father, when the beer was ready, which happened once during one of my teetotaler grandmother's visits, he would put it in the bottles and put the batch number on this wonderful woodcut. My mother used Indian bedspreads for tablecloths, and this is what our table looked like. That is a lamb chop bone, my father's favorite dinner, on that plate. And we see these implements. You can see up there his magnifying glass and this knife, fork, and spoon, which we see in a lot of his drawings later in his life, or beginning at this time. Every Wednesday night, for years, my father, Frank Lobdell, Elmer Bischoff, and early on before he died tragically young, David Park, they hired a model, or sometimes two, and drew until all hours of the night. One of the most interesting drawing exhibitions that I remember seeing presented some of the drawings of these artists that had been grouped according to particular nights and poses. It was a bit like hearing the same story from three different observers, or seeing an event from slightly different angles. Except for these drawing nights, he worked alone in the studio. This is his Healdsburg studio. When late in life I worked for him as his secretary, he often received lovely letters, usually with impressive resumes attached, asking if the sender could be a studio assistant. I was instructed to write and say that he worked alone, and that the only presence he would allow when working was his dog, Amy. And Amy went every day, patient Amy, for hours, sitting on that little square of rug, watching him, watching his every move, not even going out to pee. His studios over the years shared certain characteristics. There were the smells of paint and turpentine. There was, whenever possible, diffuse north light. There were lots of art books lying about and tools, and of course all sorts of paint and materials on the tables and on the floor that were in an order known only to him. In the figurative years, there would be Indian bedspreads to be used with the models. So you can see one of them over there. We collected these. As soon as they got a hole in them, they belonged to my father. And so he had a very large collection of different Indian bedspreads. There would be things tacked up on the wall, some of which had to do with what he was working on, and others that were there simply because they interested him in some way. And this is a wall where he's getting ready to have a show, so he's got things up there to choose from, some of which were in the show and some of which weren't. The chair where he sat when he was thinking and looking was consistent for many years from studio to studio. A black Naga-hide armchair for which he had built a height extender because it was too low to the ground. There was also a black folding chair right here, which appears in multiple paintings and drawings in various alterations, and an old wooden desk chair here, and a large rattan chair that you saw in the earlier painting of the chair outside, and which appears in many other paintings and drawings. For a palette, he used paper plates. There was lots of stuff on the floor, cutout paper, coffee cups, objects, etc., and many dust curls. He often painted what was around him, so it is no surprise that studio paintings figure prominently in his work. So here you can see that same rattan chair in this one. This is a studio in Berkeley, which is currently under the BART station, but it had a red checked floor, and we have quite a few drawings and paintings with this wonderful red checked floor on it. Then here, that's the folding chair, which he's decorated for the purposes of this painting. And the sink in his studio. And this, again, still is the Berkeley studio there. I do remember, then this one is the studio. This is out the studio window of his Ocean Park studio. Now, I have always contended that because these windows, they pushed out like that, and they make this angle here when they're out. I've always contended that this influenced the way he was kind of looking visually for a while, and that it shows up in the Ocean Park pictures. But you can see this is an early picture. He's still doing quite a bit of representational work, but still we're moving very definitely into an Ocean Park sort of look here. I do remember seeing my father work in his studio a few times, mostly when I was quite young. He was very physically involved with the paint and the canvas. There would be lots of contemplation and then an aggressive, active involvement with the work. His hands were strong, and when he painted, he used their strength somehow to express his ideas. He often drew at home, and I recall the same visceral connection to the paper, which was usually attached to a board that he would have in his lab. Sometimes he was so physically involved that he would actually go through the paper, and then often an elaborate patch would result. If, as he was drawing, the proportion of the paper didn't seem right anymore, he would glue on an extension. So here you can see he has decided to give my mother legs, or feet, that is. Often it seemed that the process of the patch or extension was as important as the drawing itself. There were many drawings and even paintings that have been extended in some direction. Perfection wasn't high on his list of qualities to which one should aspire. He liked things that had a past, which showed a previous form or scar. He didn't erase much, but left pentimenti for contemplation. People used to send him exotic or homemade paper, which he rarely used. He wasn't interested in fancy paper. Now, this particular work is a collage, Soda Rock 1. This is the first work he did when he moved to Healdsburg. And he used to, Soda Rock is the street that they lived on. And he went on a walk, and he collected all these little things. This is an orange juice top from a bottle. This is gum wrapper, other bits of wrapper and stuff that he came home and pasted it on here. And what interested me about this show, I don't know if other of you have had this experience with different artists, but when you see the same show in a different place, you see different things. They shine differently or recede. And there is a picture in this show. In fact, there's a poster that's been made of it that's right around the corner here that reminds me so much of this work. And they were done from the 40s to the 90s, which I think is quite fascinating. So he wasn't through with those ideas yet, and we see it manifested here. He liked classic drawing paper, which was available at any art supply store. Newsprint quality early on, unfortunately, because it doesn't age well, so we have a lot of very fragile, yellowed drawings from the early years. And he liked paper with a past. Some of you may have wondered about the Pennzoil paper referred to on the wall label for this work on paper. During the war, my mother lived with her aunt and uncle, and he worked for Pennzoil. And he brought home a huge stack of Pennzoil posters and gave them to my father because they were all blank on the other side. So then he somehow got Mother's Cookies cards also, we don't know from where. And for years, the drawings were done on the back of these posters. He used up scraps from discarded drawings, the backs of advertisements, class schedules, the backs of my homework, anything lying around. Paper was considered a valuable commodity, especially during the early years, as I'm sure you noticed in the exhibition. Now, these three works on the right were done on the extra posters from his show at Stanford, his drawing show. So he just sort of took off and made made these, which I quite love. My mother was a terrific model and clearly his muse. He would say to her, "Would you hold that position?" And as she was in conversation with someone or reading or drinking a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, and she would hold it in a lovely, lifelike way. I am still in awe. We think that may be what he was drawing in that other picture, the photograph. And then this is my mother. This painting is at the National Gallery. This is my mother sitting outside in their house in Los Angeles. I was not a good model. There aren't a lot of drawings, and there aren't any paintings of me. He said my qualities were expressed in movement and that I became dead when posing. And I really didn't like it, which comes through in some of the drawings that he did do. I have some general comments about the way that my father worked. Although he drew from life and used models during much of his career, the subjects of his paintings and some of his works on paper, excuse me, were primarily from memory. There are a few pieces that are actually called imaginary landscapes, but really nearly all his landscapes and interiors are from his mind, influenced greatly by his surroundings, to be sure, but often repurposed and rearranged. He almost never did preparatory drawings for a painting, but he often referred to or was informed by drawings or parts of drawings that he had previously made. Nor did he work from photographs, although in his things I have found newspaper or magazine photos that he'd cut out because they interested him, and some part of the photo may appear in a gesture or a shape in the painting. All artists change things. We know this because we've seen X-rays of paintings from the past that appear on the surface to be a single confident choice. But my father was interested in the evidence of the changes that a work went through as it evolved. So we see her several positions of her legs. Probably got tired holding them up in the air like that. I learned about his values as a painter over time. When I had my first lead in a play, the director sent me a bouquet of roses, and I wanted them to last forever. So being the daughter of an artist, I asked him to paint them for me. He explained that he didn't paint what others wanted him to paint, only what he felt moved to paint, and that he couldn't paint my roses. I was disappointed, but I understood completely because of the way that he presented it. I was very surprised when I returned from school to find that he did paint the roses, a lovely color drawing that I especially adore. I suppose because I really did understand that he couldn't be obligated to do it, my roses became a possible subject after all. My father was fond of cigars. You can see a cigar box in this painting here from 1956. People knew this, and they sent him boxes of cigars now and then, and he decided to make use of the boxes. He always stored things in them, and eventually, in the late 70s, he painted 13 small format Ocean Park paintings on cigar box lids, so they're all this big. They were, until recently, never sold, only given to family and close friends. This is one of them. And this is about 100 times life size or something. For a man who appreciated the continuum and the interconnectedness of the history of art as highly as anyone I've ever met, my father valued his own autonomy very much. He didn't like labels. He resisted being a member of a movement. This very labeling, I think, sometimes seemed to cause him to explore some variant or a new way of looking. Although it seemed that in some way the San Francisco Bay Area became visually used up for him in the mid-60s, thus prompting the move to Los Angeles, I think he also may have perceived Los Angeles as having a broader variety of painting, that he would be one of many different individual painters rather than a member of a movement or a school. That's all right. It happens. We'll be lucky the mine doesn't go off. He didn't think of himself as a California painter, but as a painter. He objected to being pigeonholed. He was a very opinionated man with a strong sense of right and wrong. He lived out his principles and expected others he loved to do the same. He was not very good at compromise. And I mean that in the positive as well as the more obvious negative sense. He was a combination of judgmental and discerning that was very complex. When I announced at dinner one night, that is a matter of opinion, he said, "Not really." This work on paper was originally purchased by the late pianist Eugene Stoneman. And I am so fascinated that of all the works, he picked this one because it reminds me of music, of notes, of piano keys. It's just the perfect picture for Eugene Stoneman to have picked. All artists share certain issues concerning the creative process. Although he wasn't formally trained as a musician, my father was very knowledgeable about music. His understanding of musical repertoire was incredible. He and my husband shared many late nights listening to music and discussing what they were hearing. My father and I had conversations comparing my worries as an actress that I would never work again or that I didn't know how to begin work on a character to his equivalent, the blank new canvas, particularly the first new canvas after a group of work was sent off to a show somewhere. An interruption had happened, not necessarily a bad thing, and it was time to start again. It was helpful to me to know that it wasn't easy for him, that he proceeded by using his will and his drive to paint. He, like most artists, struggled with some of the same artistic demons over his entire life, which is exemplified by this poem, which was either written or maybe found by him. We found a little snippet in his things. It is, made it from there to here, and now here's there again. The first time I saw one of the Ocean Park pictures was quite a shock. In 1968, my husband and I were visiting my parents in Los Angeles, and my father asked us if we would like to go to the studio. The last works we had seen had been representational. There was no sense from him that we would be seeing something utterly new. It was not only that the paintings were abstract, because we were familiar with his previous abstract works. I'm really referring to the mental, visual vocabulary necessary to understand something unexpected and indeed unimagined. He probably enjoyed our surprise and our loss of words. Gradually, as we relaxed and looked and stopped trying to place this work in any category, we began to see and understand and ultimately to appreciate it enormously. It was a very special day. There were certain forms, shapes, and even themes that interested my father for his entire life. Some of the symbols that derived from heraldry, such as the Maltese cross, or checkered quadrants or diagonal quadrants, began to fascinate him, I think, when, as a boy, he looked at the Wyeth illustrations of King Arthur. And at about the same time, his grandmother brought him reproductions of the Bayeux tapestry from France. Other recurring shapes are related to cards, clubs, and spades particularly. And in the early 80s, he worked on a series of clubs and spades in the middle of his work on the more recognized Ocean Park paintings. Now these, the two drawings, works on paper on the left are original works on paper. The one on the right is an etching made at Crown Point Press during this same period when he was exploring the clubs and spades. And this next slide, this is a slide. Oh, I am dating myself. This is an egg, an Easter egg that he made with my children. The spade wraps around the Easter egg, so when you roll it, you see the spade. So these are three views of the egg. In his own work, an early drawing of his marine jacket relates strongly to historical works of other artists. It also relates to some of his drawings of coats in the 60s and to his later etchings of coats ranging from realistic to abstract for the Arion Press book of Yeats' poetry, published shortly before he died. The symbol of a coat on a hanger comes from a favorite Yeats poem concerning approaching death. And this poem was called 15 Apparitions, and it contains the line, 15 apparitions have I seen, the worst a coat upon a coat hanger. So this is again when he's ill and contemplating his own death. My father basically painted 365 days of the year. Really, he was always working because he was always looking and deeply noticing, even when he seemed to be doing something else. Recreation was basically uninteresting to him, so the ski trips and the trips to Hawaii that many of my California friends experienced were not part of our life. But we drove across the country a couple of times, and my father took summer teaching jobs in Colorado and in Los Angeles, where we rented someone's house and had a new life for brief periods. But he went to the studio daily, as usual. He and my mother took several trips to Europe. This is a drawing from a sketchbook in Naples, to see paintings there and to visit friends. But even on his travels, he looked in his particular way and sketched, did some etchings, and sometimes painted. And in 1965, they were sent by the State Department as emissaries for the arts to the Soviet Union. This next painting, Recollections of a Visit to Leningrad, is clearly an homage to the Matisse paintings he and my mother saw tucked away in the Hermitage and Pushkin museums on that absolutely thrilling trip to the Soviet Union. My parents left Los Angeles in 1988 and moved back to Northern California, as I said, to Healdsburg. He became sick not very long after they moved, and there are not any completed oil paintings during that time. At the end of his life, my father was unable to get to a studio, so we set him up with a place in the mudroom of his house where he could work. He did some etchings and lithographs and a few drawings. He worked a lot with pieces of colored paper, which he placed on a maquette tacked up on the wall or sometimes on a board in his lap. I am struck by the feeling that some of the ideas in the work in these last few years were related to some of his earlier work that you see in this show, as I mentioned before. He was still wanting to express his ideas and was impatient with his physical limitations, which came far too early in his life. He was only 70 when he died. I think of my father's work as a series of intimate spaces to which the viewer is allowed to enter and to experience. There is a sense of order in even his most chaotic works that calms me and pleases me at a very basic level. When he died, someone said that he had a sense that my father had entered into the place that is presented to us in his Ocean Park paintings and drawings. And that is where I like to think of him, too. Thank you. Thank you. I would be happy to take any questions if you have some. Yes?
Two questions. Did he consider himself a California artist?
Did he consider himself a California artist? No, he considered himself an artist. He really didn't feel that he was bound by any place, but he painted there a lot, so a lot of the light and could certainly be connected with California in that way. He loved the light bouncing off of the water in California.
Yeah, the other question is, he liked Matisse. Did he ever visit the Baltimore Museum of Art?
Oh, yes, many times. Yes, he did. And they just did a beautiful show called Matisse Diebenkorn. The curator may be here, I think. Yes, there she is. Yes.
Yes, a little bit about your mother. Was she an artist herself?
No, my mother, during my entire childhood, was studying psychology. First off in New Mexico in Urbana, and then she was pursuing her PhD at University of California. She did absolutely everything for her degree, including teaching, and she worked primarily with animals. She ran the rat lab at Cal. And never got her degree because when they decided to move to Los Angeles, she hadn't written her thesis yet, even though she'd gathered all the information, passed her orals, everything. She never got to be Dr. Diebenkorn. But she made this career of hers. Well, she was a working mother, number one, so that was unusual at that time. But she was very present at the house. We had dinner together every night. It turns out, I found out as an adult, that my mother got up at 4 o'clock in the morning every day to run the rats through their maze, and then came home, went back to bed, and then got up and fixed us, my brother and me, breakfast. So she definitely had quite an interesting life, and she posed for my father a lot, as I mentioned. A lot of the drawings that aren't actually of my mother look like my mother, because they just do. She was very beautiful and very poised, and just really a good wife for an artist, I think, to have had.
Yes, she must have been very flexible when I see all the moves. And
Yes.
She must have been a great woman, so thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, she was very flexible, sometimes more than some of the rest of us. Yes.
How much interaction did he have with other artists? One thing that struck me in your presentation was the series of the tool drawings, and the coat hanger drawings. Reminded me of Jim Dines' work. I wondered if there was
Not really a connection with him. They're slightly different generations, if I'm not mistaken. The artists that he was most involved with were earlier in San Francisco. There were, as I mentioned, David Park was a mentor of his, wonderful man. Elmer Bischoff, Frank Lobdell. And then when he moved to Los Angeles, William Bryce was a close friend, but all the artists knew each other, and so I'm certain that he met Jim Dine, but I don't recall ever meeting him in my house when I was living there. But I didn't live there when they moved to Los Angeles. I was already married. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Did your father enjoy teaching art students?
Did my father enjoy teaching art students? Very much. He and I talked about that a bit. You learn so much from your students. It's very inspiring. And I think he did like it a lot, and we've heard from lots of his students that he was very present and a good teacher. So I never saw him in action, but yes. Yes.
Yes. How many pieces compose the Ocean Park series?
There are 164, is that right? Oil paintings, 164, and then lots of works on paper, and I'm not sure how many.
Probably approaching 1,000.
Probably approaching 1,000. This is the head of the foundation, he knows. Yes. Any other questions? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for coming to the Eastern Shore. We really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm enjoying it.
I see the Ocean Park series, a significant number of them at the Corcoran,
Yes.
maybe 15 years ago. And as we were leaving, I noticed they were going to have a Saturday Kids Symposium. Paint your own Diebenkorn. Do you have a feeling for about how long he would work on one of the Ocean Park series? And did he work on more than one of them at a time?
Did you all hear the question? Okay. Yes, he did work on more than one at a time. Some of them took many years. Some of them were worked on and then put away for a while and then picked up again. And they have many, many, many layers to them and scrapings. And I was there one day when he drew with charcoal or something black some of the lines in the ocean parks after the painting part was complete, and then he would spray it with this fixative. So I was there one day when he was running around going like this on on the paintings. So they did take a long time, and but he had good days and bad days too. You know, he'd be working on one and he'd come home and he'd be really down. That it just wasn't coming together or whatever. So it wasn't a quick process. Not very many things were a quick process for him. He was a person who enjoyed the process and didn't object that the process dragged on. Actually, I think he rather liked that. So he didn't do a lot of quick sketches. There are some, to be sure, but it wasn't the way I think of him as working most of the time. Yes.
I really enjoyed it when you said that he taught you how to see. How did he teach you how to see? And how do you teach someone how to see?
Well, by sharing what you're seeing, I think. So the example that I gave about the bridge, we drove across the bridge often to go to San Francisco. We had friends there, or we went to dinner, or we did whatever. And you see a large proportion of the bay right there by the bridge. You can see it. And it changes color every day. And he would always talk about it. He would just say, look at it today. And there's another example of this. There was a building in Berkeley that had been owned by, it was an old building. He loved old buildings. He loved seeing what had been before coming through and all that. And this building had been owned by, I believe, an East Indian, and maybe for quite some time. So there were several layers of paint, and they were quite bright colors. So you would see the outer color, and then you'd see the color that was peeling off, and then you'd see another color that was peeling off. So he used to look at that and comment on that. And I think it really comes down to sharing what you actually are seeing, not telling the person that that's what they have to see, but encouraging the act of seeing. I think a lot of people don't look. They see, but they aren't really looking. And yes, I hope I answered your question. Yes. Yes.
Did your father ever destroy any of his own work?
Oh, yes. Lots of things, yeah. He didn't do what David Park did, which is burn a huge proportion of his work. When he moved from abstraction to representational painting, David Park, he took all of his abstract paintings to the dump and burned them, which is just a terrible loss. My father didn't ever do that, but if a picture, well, here's a little story. I'll be quick. What time is it? Well, I'll be quick. He made a drawing that my mother loved, and he gave it to my mother. But he kept saying to her that there was something not quite right about the drawing. And so my mother asked us to keep it in our house so that he couldn't get at it. So I had it in my house, and every time my father came to visit, he'd say, there's something the matter with that painting. And he'd stare at it, and then we'd distract him, and he'd, do his thing. So one day, and it was Christmas, and literally the food was coming out of the oven, my father said to my son, would you get me a screwdriver and some construction paper and some markers. And he took the work apart, and he changed one triangle in it from black to white. And then he put it back on the wall, and he never talked about it again. He was totally satisfied. The opposite happened many times. So he would be staring at something for months on end, and he would say, I don't like it, and he'd take it apart, and he'd do something, and then he'd say, it's ruined, and then he'd throw it away. So one never knew. Yeah. Yes?
I had read, I'm a big fan of your father, and I've been to the Corcoran show, and I went to the Baltimore Museum show 3 or 4 times, and went out to San Francisco to see it.
Oh my goodness.
I had read that his father, that his parents, his mother encouraged him, and like his grandmother encouraged him, but maybe his father didn't encourage him. Did his father ever get to know him as an artist?
Yes, and his mother did not encourage him, not at all. His grandmother did, for sure. But no, his parents had other ideas. They wanted him to be a lawyer or a doctor, like many parents want their children to do, not knowing what that child really wants. But I think they were very proud of him because he was successful before my grandfather died. However, they never understood his work. And for example, my father gave my grandmother a small work for her birthday or something, and she had her whole house repainted to match the colors in the painting, and my father just So that's sort of where they were with the understanding of his work, which was, I'm sure, very debilitating for him. But they were not unkind about it. It was not something they understood or cared about. Yes.
You talked about the location being so important to his life, and particularly California. Was there any thought ever of going back to Oregon, back to where he was born?
He was only born in Oregon by chance. His parents were San Franciscans. My grandfather had been sent by his company there for just a few years. And my father was born while they lived there, and they never intended to stay, and they moved back when he was about 3, I think. Yeah, so he did, of course, go to Oregon, and that's where the Rogue River is, right? Yeah, he went down the Rogue River with some friends one time, I remember. Yeah, that was just a fluke. Anything else? Yes?
Who has inherited his gift?
You mean in terms of being the family? Well, everyone in the family is involved in the creative arts of everyone. But nobody is a painter. No one is a painter. We have 3 grandchildren. 2 of them are very interested in drawing and painting, and whether they continue to be, one never knows, But they also are involved with music. Everybody loves the arts in our family, but nobody necessarily will become a painter. You just don't know. I mean, in my case, I drew a lot as a young child, and in fact, I was telling someone last night won a contest, and my picture was up in the hall in my school, and people were standing around it, and they said, "Oh, she's going to follow right in her father's footsteps." That was it. I never drew again. So, is that? Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you.